Madam Speaker, the opposition's model today is premised on the assumption that every leader of a developing country, be they in like Latin America, be they in Africa, be they in the Middle East, will always, when there's a giant influx of money, always, one, not care about their population and their population's interest, and two, be instantly corrupt. We've already talked about how great, enormously offensive that is, and how essentialist that is. But secondly, those were also exactly the same sort of people who they wanted their, who still worked under their model, who they now wanted the UN, when the UN is now giving out these increments of more money to, will hope that they will do it in the best possible way, and the UN will enforce that appropriately. Madam Speaker, there are three questions in this debate. Firstly, what is better, should we value the self-determination of nations, and have they forfeited their right to sovereignty? Two, what is best for economic development? Three, what is best for political development? Both in terms of avoiding corruption and in terms of preventing instability. First question, self-determination. We gave you a lot of analysis as to the problematic history of these countries and about how their sovereignty has been breached time and time again by colonial powers, and how because of that they have a particularly strong claim to sovereignty in and of itself. And secondly, given that a lot of these countries are democratic, not perfect democracies, or sometimes stable democracies, but particularly problematic economic circumstances, the overriding their sovereignty and taking their money and giving it to a transnational organization is particularly problematic in reducing the legitimacy of those governments. They told their response was a fewfold. Firstly, we already have abrogate sovereignty when people aren't being looked over. Obviously a reference to R2P policy. There is a difference between genociding your people and not having an efficient government. And the barrier for sovereignty isn't reached by that. And secondly, we had this analysis of constantly well, when they government tax them less, they have less sovereignty. We would just flatly deny. We would say that to the extent the government is to the extent the government is taking less money from its citizens, it's probably a better government than not. And finally, they try to narrow the debate by saying, well, any government which has a claim to sovereignty would probably follow our model. We think because their model encompasses so many different countries, both in terms of economic development, but in terms of political development, there's going to be a lot of countries which have quite coherent sovereignty and quite stable governments, but they may not have economically developed so far, such as Dutch disease is still potentially a problem. Second question. So basically, sovereignty is a really, really important concept, and they never established why economic factors were a reason to breach it. But even if it was, let's turn to the second question. Economic development. What's best? So, there was a lot of analysis in this on both sides. So, on the affirmative, we have the argument this creates Dutch disease in terms of incentivizing, in terms of putting all the focus on one element of the economy at the expense of all the others. And we told you about the problem is there is no opportunity cost problem in this debate. And it's not every dollar that goes towards mining is a dollar that could have gone towards education or health or other industries, because there's no dollar to begin with. To the extent that mining investment funds itself, because suddenly transnational companies are willing to come in front of the initial capital of investing, so for a cut of the profits. There was never any these countries never had never had to make the choice under the status quo between mining and human capital, because they can do both. So what do we hear in response? Well, they changed their model halfway through the debate and said, well, we're going to have, obviously the UN is going to give out loans to, is going to release some of this money on, for them to do certain human capital projects, which we approve of. Here's the problem. We think the UN, as we told you at first, is a particularly problematic body for doing this, for a few reasons. One, the general malaise of the UN in terms of their inability to do anything efficiently. But secondly, let's assume they were efficient. We told you how a whole bunch of countries, particularly the powerful ones like US, China, Russia, have enormous incentives to manipulate these countries and determine the definition of things like economic development and political stability in ways beneficial to those countries. And to the extent we think that they will often try to prioritize certain development goals which help their own national interest over that country's. So to the extent we think that the government of a country will more often than not have its own people's interests at heart more than the United Nations would. And even if the United Nations did have its own interests at heart, we just didn't we just flatly denied throughout the history of organizations like the IMF and the World Bank that those organizations institutions are necessarily the best at instituting development goals. So what other analysis did we have here? We told you about how how this results in more money in the country in terms of more money coming in and circulating around. They said, well, it's not a huge amount, and that money would be better given that there's only one person pressing buttons in our mind, it's not really going very far. This just shows they have no conception of like how mines or other natural resources work. Because like there is more to like the extraction of natural resources than pushing buttons. Like all of us like there were a lot of people employed, both in terms of not only the initial extraction, but also like the logistics of ensuring that the extraction like continues at a proper rate. And then the support structures and support services for looking after that employment group. So the money actually travels very far and is like quite a diverse workforce. But secondly, we never heard any analysis. It's the idea that, well, the government is like obviously going to earn a lot of tax revenue from the money they're getting from these mines. Their analysis was, well, that's no value when like none of the money is reaching the poor. But we even told you, even in our worst case scenario, where the government is entirely corrupt, we think like some money will still reach the poor. And they consider that in their analysis about political patronage, in that the government has an incentive to buy off political groups to stay in power. To the extent they are buying off groups, it necessarily means they are parting with their money to like to the people. So to the extent that money is flowing back into the country, which we think is great. So, other things we told you was how this reduces like incentives for for investment in infrastructure and hospitals. They said those incentives already exist. Yes, but the capital doesn't. That's the problem. And once again, they fell back on the model but obviously the UN will release that. So to the extent the opposition is essentially conceding that that the money is necessary to development, it should just be controlled by a transnational institution, not by the governing country. Final question: what's best for political development? So. They made analysis that this entrenches certain governments and through mechanisms of patronage by the medium to buy the reins of power. Few response to this. Firstly, this is directly contradictory on the material of how this increases political instability. You can't entrench a political party and a political government and make it stronger, while at the same time increasing political instability in a country. For that tension, we think it's more likely to increase the political stability of governments through increasing their legitimacy, because they're no longer losing their resources to the UN. Because not only are they showing they're impotent in terms of losing their resources to the UN, but they're showing they economically can't run the country. Because now they have to rely on the economically development goals that the UN is setting for them, instead of what they feel is objectively the best for their own citizens. So. Other analysis they brought was this idea, and secondly, to the extent that they made the argument that the government is now spending money in order to stay in power, so that they can get more votes and so forth in the democratic countries, because there are democratic countries which would be affected by this model. That means if they're spending them in such a way that the people are choosing to vote for them, well then obviously the people are pretty happy with the choice of government spending those countries are making, and we don't have any issue with that government staying in power, given they are obviously doing what their people feel is a good job, as opposed to what the UN feels is a good job. And finally, we had this bizarre analysis on how reduction of tax and means there's no dialogue between government and people, because governments don't need the people anymore, except for getting them elected. We think a more meaningful thing of dialogue between governments and people is the government spending on their people. We gave you analysis about how the discovering oil in the United Arab Emirates enormously helped that government's ability to ensure its own political stability, as well as ensure fantastic lives for citizens and bring them out of the Bedouin existence they previously had. We also gave you analysis about how this helps the perception of strong governments, and how stronger, more stable governments is more likely to lead to the development of political institutions in the future. And finally, we gave you analysis about how we just don't think the UN is ever going to come to a coherent arrangement about what constitutes a politically stable government. So because at the end of the day, this massively hurts the economic development of these countries, and because we, at the end of the day, trust countries to spend their money more than we trust the UN, we on this side of the House are proud to oppose.